Okay, precious, good morning, you all. Oh my gosh, it's so lovely to see so many people in person. I'm Liz Miller, she, her pronouns, adolescent and young adult medicine doc, and just incredibly delighted to have the opportunity to introduce one of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Tamera Coyne-Beasley, who I am so grateful is going to share her insights with us this morning to really kick off our 12th annual Adolescent Health Research Symposium. So Dr. Coyne-Beasley is the Darrell Dawkins Endowed Chair in Adolescent Medicine, the Division Director of Adolescent Medicine, Vice Chair for Pediatrics for Community Engagement, and Professor of Pediatrics in Internal Medicine at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. And her areas of research are in community engagement, policy program development, all focusing on adolescent health and well-being, sexual and reproductive health, risk behaviors and resiliency, global health, disasters, pandemic responsiveness, immunizations, violence and injury prevention, and health equity. Just absolutely extraordinary career. She is the member of the Council of the American Pediatric Society and served as the co-chair of the Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. She was also a contributing author on the APS's Racism series at the intersection of equity, science, and social justice, and served on the selection committee for the Dr. David G. Nichols Health Equity Award. She's a member of the Pediatric Academic Society's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, past president of our national organization, the Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine. As a vaccine researcher, Dr. Coyne-Beasley was also appointed by the Secretary for Health and Human Services to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, where she was engaged in the development of vaccine recommendations and policies for the nation. So collectively, Dr. Coyne-Beasley is just simply amazing. And personally, when I was first getting my just forays into adolescent health research, one of my earliest grants, actually my first one, was to be a scholar in the William T. Grant Foundation. And Tamera was several years ahead of me in this career development award and welcomed me with open arms and has been an extraordinary mentor, friend, colleague over the years. And so I'm just so delighted that she was able to join us in Pittsburgh this year and to really help us underscore the critical importance of promoting youth thriving in all its dimensions as we spend the day together with the Adolescent Research Symposium. So Tamera, thank you.
Oh my goodness, I think I'm gonna cry. Like that was just such an amazing, thank you so much. And we have known each other. We won't say how long because it really determines, we'll tell people how old we might be. So I thank you all for being here. I know that since COVID, many of us don't come to Grand Rounds anymore, so your presence is incredibly meaningful to me. I'm gonna go ahead and start with some disclosures. I did disclose more disclosures for the format because I do work with pharmaceutical companies as helping them to develop vaccines, but it's not relevant for this presentation. But I did want to disclose those things that I thought were relevant. I don't have any relevant financial relationships that could be impacted by the content in this. However, I am heavily invested and impacted by the content of this activity. And so for me, and hopefully for many of you, this is not just an academic exercise. And that is because our families, our children, our adolescents are impacted by the content of this activity. And also just want to make sure we understand that I won't be able to cover it all in 40 minutes. There are some acknowledgements I have of myself that I want to acknowledge both Dr. Elizabeth Miller, we call her Liz, you may as well, and Dr. Allison Sombach, because they are not only important individuals and special people in the field of adolescent medicine, but I've also had the opportunity and pleasure to collaborate with them. And so you'll see, I was very intentional about making sure that we had some representations of our work together. I also would not be a proper past president if I didn't acknowledge the Ohio Valley chapter that actually is having their meeting here today, and some of whom were able to go out last night, and also acknowledge the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine here for all of the work that they do. They've gained some great faculty members too, I heard. I'm a little bit jealous, but I'm really excited to be able to be here with all of you. So what are my objectives for today? What I'd like us to do today is to recognize the engagement and efforts of children and adolescents as advocates for civil rights and equity. I want us to identify the impact of racism and discrimination on adolescent health, but also their impact on health disparities. I also would like us to think about and recognize what we can do to begin to dismantle structural racism. So I'm hoping you'll allow me to take you on a historical journey. The historical journey is actually quite relevant because I'm now in Birmingham, a place where I never thought that I would be. I grew up in the 60s and actually went to school, started my school education in the 60s. And so coming to Birmingham was a place I never thought I would be. But I thought I'd start out first remembering the Birmingham church bombing. And what you see underneath it is the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, which is right here, which actually is a place where I serve on the board of directors. But we've got to acknowledge that it was this bombing, along with some other events, that led to the children's movement as it related to civil rights. In fact, it was because of the children engaging in civil rights that the church was bombed, because that was the meeting place of young people as they sought to advocate for civil rights. I can't show this picture without acknowledging these young people and telling you how old they were. Addie Mae Collins was 14, and they're in the order of the pictures. Carol Denise McNear was 11. Carol Rosalind Robertson was 14, and Cynthia Dion Wesley was 14. This bombing occurred actually this month, 61 years ago. And so I'd like to, again, share some context of the engagement of young people in this movement. And I do this for one particular reason, and that is, well, maybe 2 or 3 reasons. One, to acknowledge how important it is to engage young people, and that in fact, young people can make a difference in some of the complex issues and things that we're dealing with in our society. So please don't forget about our young people. So Ruby Bridges, at the tender age of 6, she was the first person to advance civil rights in November of 1960, when she became the first African-American student to integrate a school in the South, and this was in Louisiana. We then had the Little Rock Nine, which were a group of adolescent high school students who challenged segregation in the public schools of Little Rock, Arkansas, where they actually integrated that school. Emmett Till was a 15-year-old African-American male who actually grew up in Chicago, but had relatives in Mississippi. He actually was accused of whistling at a local white woman and was lynched and beat up, as you actually see here. When I think about the catalyst for civil rights, this was also a huge catalyst for that movement, particularly due to the bravery of his mother, who allowed his casket to be open, as you see here. Claudette Colvin, how many of you have heard of Rosa Parks by a show of hands? Great, great. It sounds like, looks like almost everyone did. Well, she wasn't the first person who actually didn't give up her seat. The first person who didn't give up her seat actually was Claudette Colvin. So you might say, well, why didn't we band around her? She was a young teen. She was 15 years of age, and she actually was pregnant as well. And so it was determined that Rosa Parks would be a figure that people could rally around. But what's important to note is that when this 15-year-old girl did not give up her seat, she was actually found guilty of segregation violation. She was actually put into jail, and she actually had a record in police and actually spent some time in a police jail as well. And hopefully some of you have heard about Greensboro 4. They were actually in Greensboro, North Carolina at North Carolina A&T. This may be familiar to you. It's a Woolworth counter. And the great thing about this particular event is that it sparked the engagement of college students all across our country, not only in sit-ins, but also in bus boycotts, as well as traveling throughout the country. But I also want us to remember Amanda Gorman. She's the first person to be named the National Youth Poet Laureate, who in her experiences of inequity and the trauma of racism, in her resiliency, encourages us and inspires us to choose light over hate. So today, when I talk to you about the clinical impact of racism, its impact on health, its impact on health disparities, I'm asking you to remember the tremendous resiliency, potential, and ability of young people to be engaged and to create a more free, anti-racist, and equitable society, and to remember to engage them in our efforts. And I'm asking you to open your hearts and to open your mind and to think about the things that you can do to assist them. So let's talk a little bit about adolescents. Adolescents and young adults make about 25% of the populations. They are also one of the most ethically and racially diverse age groups in the United States. And it also is a critical developmental stage. There are several developmental tasks that you can see in this interrelated circle on the right, where they are doing things like trying to develop and apply abstract thinking, adjusting to a new physical sense of self. Everyone remember all those anxieties around puberty? And developing and striving for stable and productive peer relationships, while they're also striving for autonomy and independence from their parents. It's also during this time where they try to develop a personal, moral, social, physical identity among a world that might actually produce non-affirming messages, as well as conflicting messages about what it is to be a leader and to be a good person. When we think about adolescence also, it's also a time where there's great brain plasticity and rapid brain growth. So due to the chemical and brain changes that they have, they're also very susceptible to stress. They're very susceptible to negative things in the environment. And so while it's also an incredible time for opportunity, it's also a time for vulnerability, particularly to negative cues. Young people during this time of adolescence develop habits and have experiences that impact their social, physical, psychological, and social well-being. And it would be one thing if it just stayed there in their adolescence. But in fact, it can be transmitted into their adulthood. It can also be transmitted through their generations. So another really important part of adolescence that we've talked about already, and I want to refer to a paper that Dr. Miller and I did on identity development. Identity development is also a critical and crucial part of adolescent development. And when we think about Eric Erikson, I don't know if people are still learning about him, he's a psychologist. He felt that identity development, in fact, was one of the most important tasks of adolescence. So your adolescents are asking and trying to discover answers to the questions, who am I? And who do I want to be? When we think about racism and other isms in our country, we have to understand that not all teens are given the opportunity and agency to determine who they want to be or who they actually even are. And when we think about adolescents of color, and again, we'll talk about some other isms too, but I wanted to focus on one in particular, it also impacts their self-concept and their self-esteem. And it's not just what people hear or experience, it's actually about the actions that other people may perpetrate against them. So the exposure to racism and other discrimination and the messages and the cues that they receive are all really important and impact their development, whether they'll have a positive self-concept or a negative. One of the things that I think is really important, certainly the research has already demonstrated that parents have an opportunity to impact this. How do they do that? They do it through something that's called racial ethnic socialization. What does that mean? It's really counterbalancing all those negative cues that they might receive and providing them with good and positive information. But what I contend to you is that we as providers can also provide positive messages for young people to counteract and to counterbalance what they're receiving in the world. What about intersectionality? There are many of us, all of us, who have multiple dimensions of our lives and of our identities. And in fact, some of us will have multiple marginalization of those. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, you may be a person of color and you may actually be a woman. You could have a religion that's non-dominant in the society with which you live. And so it's really important to understand that these multiple spheres of influence, particularly if they're marginalized, are not additive. It's actually what we would call exponential. And so some of those domains that we would think about would be race, ethnicity, religions, politics, vocation, and gender identities. Again, I want to make sure we understand that family life, so building strong families. And so when we talk to our young people, also understanding about their families will be really important when we think about their positive influences and their agency, their resiliency, and their ability to be protected. I also want to make sure that we understand, because sometimes when you listen to the media, you can get mixed messages, or let's call it disinformation. And so when you think about a person's identity, people with multiple identities, they're interconnected and all of them impact their lives. So you can be Indian and you can be Black and you can be a woman, and all of those things impact. You don't get to choose which part of yourself that you want to express. And so again, the most important thing one of the important things I just want to emphasize again is that these multiple marginalized or intersectional effects are exponential, not summative. So when we think about what young people and really what all of us have to engage in, I want us to also remember the social political determinants of health, because they in fact also deal with how young people are able to express their health and their morbidity and mortality. Social political determinants of health are usually in 5 categories, including economic stability, neighborhood and physical environment, education, food, community and social context, and healthcare systems. It's important to know because people will always try to stigmatize and blame young people based on the behaviors that they may have. But what's really important to note is that 60% or more of anyone's, including adolescents' health outcomes, are not because of their behaviors. They're based on the social political context in which they reside. How does that impact them? It impacts them in their morbidity and mortality, their life expectancy, healthcare expenditures, health status, and functional limitations. And as you can probably guess, there are disparities in, or even unequal distributions of social determinants of health. So there's another way that we could look at social determinants of health, particularly when we're thinking about adverse childhood experiences. And in fact, adverse childhood experiences are often indicated when we think about what someone's social determinants of health are like. There are two, when adverse childhood experiences were first brought to bear, we talk mostly about adverse childhood experiences, the first 2 categories on the left, and adverse circulatory expression. But when we think about adolescence, there are the next 2 categories that are actually incredibly important. We'll talk first about adverse community environments. When young people grow up in adverse community environments where there's high unemployment, limited economic mobility, food deserts, poor housing conditions, low access to social services, unsafe neighborhoods, and parks or systemic racism, they actually have the opportunity to have greater morbidity and mortality, as well as other negative outcomes. I want to talk about adverse cultural exposures, and this is where it gives me the opportunity to tell you that the same things that I'm talking to you about racism in particular also apply to any ism or any negative cues that a young person experiences. And so adverse cultural exposures include, but are not inclusive of all the categories that we have, are homophobia, xenophobia, racism, ageism, ableism, sexism, and classism. Hopefully you'll note that racism is in both of these categories. And part of this, as I will show you a little bit later, is that our country was built upon racism and not just of one particular group. So this was just a paper that some of our colleagues and I is actually a chapter about the traumatic impact of racism and discrimination on young people. And it really just ascribes to what we've talked about just now, is that adolescents are vulnerable to discrimination because their developmental growth depends on social interaction and support. And I can't emphasize that enough, social interaction and support. One of the many critical tasks is to establish aspects of identity. Forming identity is not formed in a vacuum, but rather are shaped by the different spheres, influences, and exposures that you've developed. And so I will, all throughout the presentation, give us mandates for ourselves. Be that exposure that's positive. Sometimes it's just asking the questions that we may not normally ask. We want you, the experiences that they have kind of have two opportunities. They can create tension and deliver toxic levels of stress, or with the right support and people around them can build resiliency and other strengths. So help them be resilient and develop other strengths. So what is race? I actually hope I don't really even have to talk about this, but I can't have the talk without doing it and making assumptions. I want you to know that it actually is a social construct to classify, categorize, and create hierarchies to ensure that there's unequal distribution of privilege, resources, freedom, health, and power. It's defined as attitudes and beliefs and actions resulting from categorizing people based on phenotype, which is what someone looks like. And I'm sure we all know and can point to opportunities in where the phenotype didn't match what our assumptions were. And then the most important thing here is to note that we are all brothers and sisters. We all share 99.9% of the same DNA. And in fact, we can trace all of our heritage back to a same area. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about the history of racism in the United States, not only to help people to understand that this is built on a long history, right? And to make sure that we can acknowledge all the contributions that have occurred in our country because of a variety of groups that we've had the opportunity to have here. So when we go beyond, we start at the pre-Civil War era in the second half of the 16th century. The colonization of the Americas led to the genocide of American natives who were here first. Shortly thereafter, in 1619, we had the African slave trade, which became one of the foundations of the North American economy. We then, in 1830, had the Trail of Tears, which was the Indian Removal Act that actually required all Indians to be moved to the west of the Mississippi, of course, an area that many of them had not been in, and that was not necessarily one that was favorable to their lifestyle. And in this Trail of Tears, it's called the Trail of Tears, in fact, because 25% of Cherokee Indians actually died during that journey that was required of them. In 1831, we had the abolitionist movement that was actually started by slaves and Quakers who felt that it was a moral issue for them. In 1846, we had the war with Mexico. And as a result of that war with Mexico, we purchased California, Texas, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming. And so when we think about our immigration policies and the land and who has rights to the land, remember that that land at one time was part of Mexico. In 1861, when the Civil War, there was a potential succession of 11 states. And then in 1868 and 1870, we really started trying to move to the post-war effort. And so at that time, there was citizenship and the right to vote, the 14th and 15th Amendments. But does anyone know, was everyone able to vote at that time? What intersectional part was not able to vote? Women. And so the other thing that happened, because clearly there were people who were resistant to developing equity, there were ways within the South that they tried to reinforce the old way of life. And that came through Black codes, the Ku Klux Klan, as well as Jim Crow laws. We moved to the second half of the century, and then also in 1942 to 1944, the asterisk that is here on this map, on this roadmap, actually refers to the internment of Japanese citizens. During World War II, 127 Japanese Americans were imprisoned because they were suspected of spying and being loyal to Japan, while at the same time, German Americans and Italian Americans were not. And then I want to go back to this. I skipped over one thing that I want to highlight. In 1846, we also had the Chinese immigration, and they actually worked in mining and agriculture and were responsible for a huge part of the transcontinental railway that we all enjoy today. So we get into the 1940s to the 1968s, and we started to have some efforts in desegregation. This is actually quite personal to me because even though I grew up in the North, I went to desegregated schools and then got involved in the whole busing project. That's a whole nother conversation. In 1932 to 1972, not stopped until 1972, we had a Tuskegee experiment. And because I'm now in Alabama, I no longer call it the Tuskegee study, even though this slide says that. And that is because words matter, language is incredibly important. And this wasn't a study, it was an experiment. In this particular experiment, individuals who were infected with syphilis, the National Public Health Service followed the pathogenesis of that infection rather than providing care and providing treatment, which at that point was penicillin. 2001, we had the US Patriot Act, which allowed for the imprisonment of Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians. In 2008, we had our first Black president, and then here we are today. And so if you think about some of the things that have happened today, we can see that there's certainly the rollback or the attempted rollback on some of these things that we've had throughout history. And just to give you one example, we can talk about voter registration or the opportunity to vote. So I want to provide just a brief framework for racism, and we'll provide this framework because the same framework will be utilized to kind of think about how we can dismantle racism. And so if we think about the individual level is something that we all can be responsible for because that is us. It's our beliefs and actions that serve to perpetuate or to witness oppression. It could be conscious or unconscious. We call that sometimes unconscious or conscious bias. And then the person who is receiving that bias can externalize it or internalize it, both with negative effects. When we think about systemic racism, we think about it in terms of interpersonal, which are the interactions between people across difference, and then also institutional, which are policies and practices at the organizational level. You can also have structural, which is across institutions and across history. And again, these are systemic. I want to briefly talk to you about some systemic processes, and we're talking actually about Pittsburgh. And so Pittsburgh is unlike any other city in the states, in the United States, you can find a redlining map for any major city. And as you might imagine, red is where you don't want to be, and you can see on here it's hazardous. C is it's definitely declining. A is the best, which is the green, and blue is still desirable. This is actually areas, Homewood and Point Breeze. Do any of you recognize these places? Anyone know what the black line is going through it? Railroad tracks. And it was funny, I was talking to Dr. Sumba this morning because there's so many similarities between Birmingham and Pittsburgh, being a steel, industry, but we have lots of railroads as well. And this is definitely one city where being on the wrong side of the tracks. And you might ask, like, why is this important? Generally, people who are of low wealth or in people of color are relegated to the red spots, which is why it's called redlining. How is that relevant? It's relevant because in these areas, you generally had the most hazardous conditions. You were exposed, and we could say even environmental injustice, if you will. These were generally places where you might have poor water, you might have pollution, you might be near a hazardous waste. If you had a home there, were actually going to be charged higher rates for your mortgage because banks would not loan to you if you were in red-lined areas. And there was outright discrimination about your ability to purchase a home in the areas that were blue or green. Notice this is 1937. If we go to 2010, the colors are different, but it's the same. Notice the railroad tracks. Notice the lighter colors are of more influence. And the way this map was actually done, it was the proportion of white people. So you can still see that there is greater segregation depending on where you lived and what your exposures are. So let's talk about the impact on health and health disparities. This is just a conceptual model that actually has evidence to validate it. When we think about racial discrimination, there are many pathways which can lead to outcomes. Some are the denial of goods, resources, and services. Another outcome is the psychological stress, but also the assault. When we think about the denial of goods and resources, that is people living in poorer living conditions, like redlining conditions like we talked about, also having decreased access to quality healthcare, or even decreased access to quality food. Psychological stress, note that the arrows are bi-directional, right? Because not only does this lead to psychological symptoms, the psychological stress can do that as well as negative coping behaviors and a physiologic stress response. And we're going to talk about what a physiologic stress response looks like as well. But what are the outcomes that you can see? Mental health outcomes are clearly things that are possible, such as anxiety, depression, substance use, and misuse. But there's also some information about how that actually also comes, particularly substance use, from the psychological stress response. But you can also have physiological outcomes, such as cardiovascular disease, decreased birth weights, increased blood pressure, and physical injury. And so to honor my colleagues who does physical injury with me, I wanted to talk about what that looks like. There's no greater physical injury that we can talk about in this country other than firearm injuries in terms of being the leading cause of death for children and adolescents. And when you look across this, you can see that since about 2018, we've actually had firearm deaths surpass motor vehicle deaths. And this is something that we've been living with for a number of years. But I want you to take a look at this particular graph that actually shows the table that's on the bottom left to see that when we talk about firearm assaults, they call it assaults. The translation, this is homicide. We can see that these death rates over time are substantially greater among individuals of color, those who are Black and those who are Hispanics when compared to whites. But we believe, Dr. Sumber and I and our colleagues, that children should have the freedom to play, learn, live, and thrive. And so we recognize and call to action our colleagues about things that can be done to address firearm violence. So I want to first talk to you about like what are one of the most important things that we talked about is that everyone wants to do surface things, right? Because you might be able to quickly give someone a gun lock, but protecting youth actually requires thinking about and talking about the root causes of violence, such as structural oppression, racism, poverty, and systemic disinvestment from communities. And then how also firearms have been used and continue to be used as tools of racial subjugation. It's interesting that our dialogue in communities is often about school shootings and mass shootings, and they actually only make up about 5% of deaths among young people. And so there's a mass shooting or there's a community shooting every single day that gets no dialogue, that gets no concern, that gets no compassion. And so how do we make sure that we don't forget about those young people in our communities daily who are quietly traumatized and actually having their well-being eroded? Wanted to make sure I also included my other colleague, because in fact, this particular paper is a position paper from the Journal of Adolescent Health of the Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine, and Dr. Miller, in addition to Dr. Silva and I, were engaged in writing this policy statement. So I talked to you a little bit about like, how does racism lead to all these negative outcomes? What really happens is the experience racism, and I want you to understand that it's just not what you may experience yourself, but we live in a world where you can experience something over and over and over and over again through social media or regular media. And so vicarious racism is a real thing as well. And so when this happens, it leads to what we call an increased allostatic load, which is the wear and tear on the body. This acts when individuals have regular, repeated, or chronic stress. It represents the physiologic consequences of the chronic response to fluctuating or heightened neural and neuroendocrine responses. So we're really thinking about someone being in a state of flight or fight all the time. And so it can affect multiple organs. And what you see here is not only the brain, but the circulatory system, as well as inflammation. And so just to list a few, again, these are not activities that a person may desire to be involved and engaged in, but because of the body's response, they can actually have these things. And so when you see a young person who you think might not have good planning skills or good decision making, understand that the neuroendocrine responses to their prefrontal cortex could be responsible for that. They might have a difficulty with learning or memory. Was there some impact to the hippocampus? They might be anxious or in a complete state of fear and anxiety more frequently than you'd like them to be. Perhaps their amygdala was activated. If we think about depression and addiction, we do know that in fact, the mesolimbic dopamine system is responsible for that, and chronic access or activation of that can cause it. Even things like heart disease and Alzheimer's, the circulatory system, we all know about the increase of arteriosclerosis and stroke in populations. But we also can have disruptions of telomeres, as well as some other things that I have listed here on this slide. I also want you to know that we've had as a subject of a National Academy committee that I was on, and then the resultant editorial that was written, or commentary that was written there after the study, that it's really important for us to, and I should say this was authored with the current president of SAHM, who was just a committee member with me at that point in time, that to address structural inequities, or to make sure that people, young people in particular, we can promote positive behaviors and outcomes, requires that we address structural inequities such as racism, promote inclusiveness and equity and youth engagement, to promote adolescent health and good outcomes. And so this gave us the opportunity to evaluate all the evidence that was available. And for those of you who are researchers, please know that there's still a lot more research that needs to be done in this area. But what I'd like you to make sure that we all understand and remember as we're sitting in our chairs, and some of us may feel that we're part of marginalized groups, and some may feel like, oh, I'm not, this may not affect me as much. I want you to know that clearly we know that racism leads to poor health and health disparities, but racism is destructive to everyone and for everyone. How is that? It creates imbalances that diminish social inclusion. It leads to incomplete citizenship, undervalued rights. We have undervalued recognition, and we actually undervalue participation, and it creates a culture of oppression. And we never know when someone that we love may adopt a gender identity or religious identity that is not dominant. It also is a corrosive and destructive force that reduces the potential of our institutions and societies. We're only able to be as innovative as a people that we allow into our circle. We're only as innovative as our ability to listen to what everybody has to contribute. And if you saw that little trail that I gave you of a history, there's been so many contributions by so many groups that it's important to understand not only the history, but what they can provide for our future. Racism also negatively affects our interpersonal interactions and relationships and lessens us as a people. It creates unhealthy tensions in the environment, which all our youth navigate for their developmental processes. And the truth of the matter, it makes us all less safe. Think about where we are today in our political environment. Do you feel less safe or more safe? Do you feel threatened or not threatened? And when we have and emphasize the differences in ourselves, that's when we create the chiasm that we have. And so understanding, in fact, that we all are 99.9% the same, that we all have the same frailties, that we all have the same desires, that we all want the same opportunities, perhaps we can get there. What can be done to dismantle racism? So I told you I was going to use that same framework for racism to think about some of the different levels at which we can operate. So let's talk about the individual levels. There are things that we can do. The very first thing is to acknowledge that racism exists, and any of those isms that I mentioned, that they all exist, and to actually understand that we all have biases. So we need to identify and address our own biases. If you want a tool to help you do that, there is an implicit association test, can be found here, that actually helps us do a series of questions in a survey like tool. You can actually discover some of the biases that you might not even recognize that you had. It's also important that we promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist, that are gender affirming, that believe in women's rights. It's also important for us to sit with discomfort and learning. And so I apologize to anyone that I might have made feel uncomfortable by presenting the history, but it's important for us to learn it. And while I apologize, it's important for you to be uncomfortable. I'm glad that you're uncomfortable if you were. It's also important, as particularly those of us who are in the position to educate our peers and trainees on how racism and other isms harm patients and our profession. It's incredibly important to do that. And remember, I gave racism as an example of how the mechanism by which all of these isms impact young people. And then it's important to meaningfully engage with others who think and look different from you. Because as you develop relationships, you get to understand that those stereotypes actually really don't exist. You get to love and maybe even like somebody that you didn't think that you would like. And so when you do these things, it's incredibly hard to hate someone that you love. It's incredibly hard to hate someone that you have developed a relationship with. And so I'm asking you also to get proximate to people who you may not have interacted with before. Interpersonal. So there are a variety of things now that are recommended, that are part of the whole spectrum of ACEs that we talked about in social determinants of health. And so the Center for Disease and Injury Prevention actually recommends screening for the things that are listed here, social determinants of health, things that we've talked about like ACEs, also things that are relevant here to this particular discussion, social and emotional status, adolescent depression, suicide, and substance use, as well as suicidal ideation. And then know that we can actually treat, we can manage disruptive behavior, ADHD, anxiety, depression, learning and developmental differences, as well as trauma. How many people knew? There have been a lot of investigators, many of you might be aware of that in Chicago, in California, the whole state of California, they actually were screening for ACEs. Why did they do that? Because they recognized that there were things that you could do to improve people's outcomes. What might those be? Mindfulness is one. Sleep. Does anyone in the room feel like they get an adequate amount of sleep? Yeah, we need to improve that. Exercise. Can we say the same about exercise? I know I can if I'm being honest. Attention to our mental health, okay? Mental health is not just a thing that is when you have a problem. You want to maintain good mental health if you have that. And ability of caregivers as well as individuals who can be caring and supportive. And so we know that providing those things can improve outcomes. And we know that we also can be those caring and providing individuals. And sometimes it will require us to step out of our offices, to do things that are traditionally in our job description. For example, when I was a resident and even up until being a faculty member, I coached boys and girls basketball. Why did I do that? That gave them the opportunity to see me in a community. But it also gave me the opportunity to have sleepovers at my house, to have people there who felt proximate and that they had known me over a period of years, who were able to share with me their real concerns. And not only were they able to share, but their parents shared and their families shared. And I got an opportunity to really know them. This also comes from another paper that Dr. Miller and I were involved in. It's looking at health equity and the impact of racism on adolescent health. How do you respond to youth with experiences of racism? And so there are a number of things, mostly in the psychological literature, that give us strategies that are evidence-informed to apply in our encounters with youth. And so validation, helping them to, normalizing and validating their experiences. Even asking about their experiences would be a step that many people don't even take. Psychoeducation is incredibly important. Teaching culturally responsive coping strategies. And if you feel that you don't know what that is or you have no experience in that, there are plenty of people that can help you. And I'm volunteering myself. Also thinking about being self-aware and critically conscious, understand the intersections of race and other historically marginalized identities. So if you see someone, again, think about all the dimensions of their lives, because in fact, they may be struggling with more than just the one that's apparent to you. Developing positive identity, exploring their strengths. And so when people come to you and they may be feeling down or they may not be having a good time, one of the things that we do in addition to screening for risk is find something good. Every single patient that you see, there's something positive that you can say, even if it's like, I'm so glad you got up in the morning and came to clinic. You got out of bed and you came, because you don't know what some of our patients have to encounter to get to my office. So if you get there before we leave, I don't care how late you are, we're going to see you, okay? And so also thinking about their externalizing and minimizing and self-blame that they may have, and recognize, we always say when we're thinking about trauma-informed care, instead of saying, what's wrong with that person? Asking, what happened to you? You know, what is it, you know, why are you feeling this way? As opposed to thinking it's something inherently wrong with the individual. Critical examination of privilege and power and of racial attitudes, and then also advocating for them and giving them, helping them to develop agency. Institutional and structural. What must professional leaders do? And I recognize we're getting close to time. So all of these things are referenced, but making sure that we understand the deleterious effects of racism on health and well-being. We as providers should take strong positions against discriminatory practices and policies, and to promote safe and affirming environments where individuals can thrive. One way that we're able to do that is by having youth advisory boards, where we give individuals a place and space within our clinic to come just to talk in the chat, not just with us. I'm no longer as cool as I used to be. About 3 months ago, one of my patients called me an elder, and I was like, what? Does she know how old I am? But clearly, you know, so I had crossed that threshold where, you know, I wasn't as relevant as they were. So I engage younger people than me that are closer to their age in that place of space. And I just had to admit it, like it's true, okay. And then identify racism where it exists in our professional societies, institutions, and practices. And it's all over the place. I would like to tell you that we as doctors and our profession has always been neutral, without any biases. But the list of things is so long that that's a lecture in and of itself. So there are some things that we can do as organizations. When I talk about organizations, it's not just our societies, but the organizations in which we work. And so I'm happy to share these slides. And what you need to do, for those of you who are in leadership, is call your institution to these questions. And these are questions, and this comes from the APS, American Pediatric Society Racism Series, where it's just like benchmarks, questions that you should ask in your organizations. Like, have the leaders demonstrated a commitment? What is their vision? Does it include diversity and equity? Have they acknowledged racism? Do they have ways and meaningful benchmarks to measure the impact of their efforts for DEI and racism? And I want to also make sure that you understand that there are places where this can't even be done now because of legislation. I'm sad to say that Alabama is one of them, but we're going to figure out how we can do this anyway. We're going to try to still hold true to our values. When you're doing this work, and I would challenge all of us to be engaged in diversity, equity, inclusion. Why? Because if you can't think about doing it for someone else, remember it impacts us as well. It's never just intellectual, it involves emotions, identities, and relationships. The work can be challenging, and sometimes you'll deal with pushback and resistance. But you all have heard the cliche, nothing good comes easy. It can be slow, overwhelming, and traumatic. And I want you to understand that your colleagues who have marginalized identities, it's trauma. When I have to think about the experience that my children, who are now young adults, experience, it's traumatic to understand that they may have to engage in some things that I wish they had never had to do. Or when I have to continually educate my colleagues who think that racism doesn't exist. I don't have that many colleagues that do that, but there are. And then we need to be able to hold each other accountable in a loving and a caring way, right? And so what we hope to be able to do is to bring our current reality, which is when we have an unequal distribution of resources, that's intentional. It's intentional, to moving from reality to equality. And again, with equality, everyone doesn't start at the same place. So giving everyone the same service is not going to work. You want to achieve equity where they actually get what they need, in this case, to see the ball game. But what about justice? When we can take away the fence or the barrier or the obstacles so they can see and don't have to stand on a box for injury prevention. We don't want anyone to fall and get hurt. But what about inclusion, right? Take away the fence. And in addition to watching the game, which many of us are doing, which sitting on the periphery because of our marginalized identity, allowing everyone to be included in the game, where everyone has the opportunity to be at the table, and not to just be included, but to feel welcomed and to feel like you belong. Those are the ideals that we should shoot for. And so I cannot, again, I'm about to end, talk about this without making sure that we understand that we need to engage our communities and youth in this work, and talk a little bit about why youth engagement is important. First of all, youth and communities are the experts in their lives, and why we often think we are not. So it's really important to engage them. It demonstrates that we have an inclusive process, and an inclusive process will more likely give us equitable outcomes. And then for young people, it actually helps them develop skills such as reasoning, decision-making, as well as self-regulation. It actually helps to negate some of those negative things we talked about that racism can do. It can help them develop a positive self-esteem, a positive outlook, because someone actually thinks that what they say and do is important, and it can increase their influence and personal stake in their community. So in conclusion, there are some things that I want to make sure that we all understand. And first and foremost, that racism is a destructive force that negatively impacts everyone. And I would also expand that to say any ism is a destructive force that negatively impacts everyone. It particularly impacts the health, well-being, and health disparities in children and adolescents of color and their families. And other forms of ACEs and discrimination also increase the stress and the allostatic load. And that is, in fact, what causes the differences in outcomes that we see. It's one of the major factors. But it also impacts their development. It impacts their identity development, as well as even their physical development. And these are important milestones during adolescence. I want you to know that it's not hopeless. If it was hopeless, I wouldn't go through the trauma of talking to people over and over and over again. There are actually actions that you can take to dismantle racism and other forms of discrimination. And young people have been, which is the entire reason why I showed you the civil rights movement, have been important leaders, collaborators, and allies in our efforts. What do we need to do when we think about anti-racist approaches? What they are strategies, theories, actions, and prejudices and practices that challenge and counter racism, inequities, prejudices, and discrimination based on race. It requires self-examination, acknowledgement, and action from all of us. So I've got two questions for you. What actions will you take, and how will you engage young people? I'm gonna give you one answer. You can vote. So just so you know, this is not my own logo. This comes from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Any of you going to the meeting this weekend will hopefully receive a button that says, I care for kids and I vote. These are some of the references from the presentation. And thank you so much for your time and consideration.